Hello, and welcome to A Book or Two to Review 14. And this book is something different. This is a naval history channel, and this book is Julia Velva, a Roman lady from York. Her Life and Times Revealed by Patrick Ottaway. Now, you're probably sitting there going, Alex, you're a naval historian. We know you like Rome, we know you like military history, but isn't this taking it a bit far? And potentially. But this is a very, very cool book. And when I saw it offered to me on the pen and sword thing where you can sign up for the books to review, because you have a system you can go click, click, click and select the books you want to review, I just thought that will either be amazing or it will be atrocious. It'll either be so great I'll be raving about it to all my friends, or it'll be so terrible that I'll be wishing I could send it back. It's great. And I'm going to read you the first paragraph before showing you the pictures inside. Julia Velva's tombstone has been a part of my life for almost 40 years. It has been my opening image in innumerable lectures on the Roman York that I have given around the country. On many occasions I have stood in front of it in the Yorkshire Museum and described its finer points. Julia Velva's tombstone is my favourite object from Roman Britain, and is the inspiration for this book. This is because it not only allows us to learn a little about two real, named people in the past, Julia Velva herself and Aurelius Merculius, her heir, but also because it shows them to us in at least a version of their home environment, a rare contemporary representation of Roman daily life. Moreover, as I hope will become clear in the course of this book, Julia Velva's tombstone is a starting point for many different messages from York's Roman past. Finally, although it was found in 1922, nearly 100 years ago, as I write this, I can claim a direct connection with the tombstone's discovery, a sort of apostolic succession, in that an elderly gentleman who attended one of my first evening classes in the early 1980s told me that, as a small boy, he had himself seen a tombstone being raised from the ground. This book is a passion project. This book is gorgeous. It has the maps. You can even see, if you look very carefully, my favourite hotel in York in this picture, if you look very, very carefully. Which is now, used to be called the York Railway Hotel, is now called the Principal Hotel. But also you can see the castle, you can see the outlines of the Roman walls. You can see what it was like. You can see the old legionary fort and the town which grew up around it. There are pictures of the stones, the carvings. It's beautiful and it's full of detail. The Roman road network. This is the sort of book you would have and you would never grow bored reading. Even if it wasn't your topic of your particular topic of interest, you would be going, "Ooh, that's something new." And if you visit York after reading this, or you visit any Roman site after reading this book, you are going to be so much more informed. That, by the way, is the diagram of the wall after it's been reinforced. See, the Romans had a nasty little trick. What they do is they build their wall, a nice thick one, on proper foundations. So it was deep and difficult to undermine, and they have a ditch in front of it. But then you notice there's a huge ramp behind it. So if you try and ram and bash through the wall, there's a lot of mass behind it to take the energy, which you can't easily see because it's sloped and because the angle it's sloped at. You can't easily see, even from a high point behind, how thick that is. So it makes the walls immensely stronger. And it is a beautiful. I have really loved reading this book. I have to admit, sometimes all the new books I get sent are one of the reasons why I'm slow producing stuff, because I am reading them all and getting distracted. And this is just a gorgeous one. But let's start off with the thing which, to be honest, is most related to what I talk about normally. And that is Chapter 2. The Making of Julia Velva's York, Legionary Fortress and Civilian Settlement. And it starts off as you wish all these sort of books on geography would do. It's just map after map after map, showing the Roman roads on the current roads, where the outline of the fortress was, what can be seen now, what could be seen then. It's gorgeous. By the time Julia Velva was born, probably sometime after the year 160, York had been a Roman for about 100 years. It had become well established as a military base and was about to become a major urban centre. Originally, York, about 300 kilometres north of London, was most likely chosen by the Roman army for its strategic location. It lies in the middle of a lowland zone, the Vale of York, which continues northwards beyond becoming the Vale of Mowbray, extending as far as the River Tees. York is also about 60 kilometres from the sea to the east, which is reached by means of the River Ouse and the Humb estuary. Today, the journey from London to York can take just under 2 hours by train, but in Roman times, even at what became a communications hub of roads and rivers, York would have been quite isolated by its distance from other towns and military bases. On a swiftest horse or by ship, it is unlikely that London, could have been reached in much less than 2 or 3 days. Nevertheless, York, as we shall see, was in touch with the rest of the Roman world, its ideas and preoccupations, and had access to its material culture in a way denied to almost all of the rest of northern Britain, except the Hadrian Wall zone. At the same time, however, most of Evacorum's day-to-day needs had to be supplied locally, and understanding the advantages and challenges of the local landscape was critical for legionary commanders and provisional governors based there. Illustration 2.4, this lovely green map, shows the relief of the geography of the York area. It will be immediately apparent that the landscape is largely low-lying. At the top of what we know today as the Mount, where Julia Velva's tombstone once stood, we are, as the name implies, almost as high as it gets in the city, 21 metres above sea level. Extending to the northwest and southeast is the ridge from which the land falls away towards the medieval walled city and the River Ouse to the northeast, and the sum of York's outer suburbs to the southwest. This ridge is part of the York moraine, composed of material deposited by retreating glaciers at the edge of the last ice age about 10,000 years ago. An outlier of the moraine, on which the legionary fortresses once stood, lies on the northeast bank of the Ouse, where natural ground level is at mostly between 12 metres and 14 metres above sea level. A simplified cross-section of the valley of the River Ouse through the centre of York appears in 2.5, which is this lovely diagram. You can see a sort of cross-section. So, still having fun with lighting. It is on the line of the main Roman approach from the southwest, between a point near Micklegate Bar and York Minster, showing natural and modern ground levels and the Roman and modern river levels. The cross-section shows, in particular, how the land, in what would become the principal urban area, rises sharply from a river terrace on the southwest bank of the Ouse. Some comments on the river level follow. The moraine is cut by the River Ouse just to the south of its confluence from the River Foss. The moraine there runs eastwards for 3.5 kilometres, reaching a high point of 32 metres above sea level at Kimberlow Hill. Beyond here, the moraine runs as far as Stamford Bridge on the River Derwent, 12 kilometres to the east of York. To the northwest of the Mount, the moraine runs for 700 metres before it's cut by Holgate Beck, and it then picks up again to run on the Acombe, now a York suburb. Another arm of the moraine runs southwest to the Dringhouses, then to the village of Copmanthorpe, before continuing towards the town of Tadcaster, thereby providing suitable raised ground for the main road of York to York. The York Moraine and the Esseric Moraine, to the south of the city, were formed at the southern edge of the Vale of York Glacier by 13,000 BP. That's before present, or the late in the Divinsian period. It's the modern phrase because we don't use before Christ anymore. Sometimes they use before present, sometimes they use before Common Era. It's all fun. I'm not so keen on before present as a phrase, I have to admit, because I find that could be a bit confusing for readers, because if you're saying 13,000 years before present, well, that's 13,000 years before now, 2021. Or if I'm reading this book in 100 years' time, 13,000 years before 2121? Yeah. I prefer BCE if you're going to have to use one. Beyond the ice limit lay Lake Humber, created by ice blocking the Humber estuary. The lake survived until about 11,000 BP, after which it drained into the Humber, leaving thick deposits of glaciolastruine clay over the Triassic sandstone that forms the solid geology of much of the Vale of York. In addition to clay, there is, as a result of glacial action, a varied pattern of quaternary drift deposits in the York area, including sands and gravels that were more suitable than the clay for early arable agriculture. In the river valleys, there are alluvial deposits of clay, silt, and sand. The moraine itself is quite variable in its geological character. In excavations at the site of a new university campus at Helsington East, 3 kilometers east of the city centre, it was shown that impermeable boulder clay is overlain by sands and gravels, and at the junction between them there are springs that account for a long history of settlement in the prehistoric and Roman periods. In places on the moraine, there are kettle holes where buried blocks of ice melting leave a void that filled up with peat. This formed a resource useful for fuel in Roman times. Peat would also have been found as in a raised bog southwest of York, immediately to the north of the moraine of Ascombe, and was formed in a lake left behind by the retreating glaciers. Goes through all the environment, and then finally gets to the Roman conquest and legionary fortress at York. It was into this landscape of small farming settlements, scattered largely on the better land for agriculture, that the Roman army arrived in about the year AD 71. However, while sheep tended by native shepherds were still safely grazing on the banks of the Ouse, that the conquest of Britain by the Romans had begun in AD 43, in the reign of Emperor Claudius. In Claudius' reign there had, according to Tacitus, been 2 sorties into the north of England, in AD 48 and then in AD 51-2. In the latter, the Roman governor, Didius Gallus, yes, he was called Didius Gladius, may have set up a temporary base at York, thereby giving the army some advance information about the site ahead of the conquest 20 years later. By the beginning of the reign of Emperor Nero, AD 54-68, most of Britain south of the line, roughly between the River Mersey and the Humber estuary, had become part of the Roman province of Britannia. In the north, the 2 native peoples named in Ptolemy's geography, the Brigantes, who occupied most of the land as far as the Scottish lowlands, and the Parisi, in what is now the East Riding of Yorkshire, remained nominally independent, although probably as client kingdoms. A client kingdom was a very particular sort of political entity cultivated and sponsored by the Roman Empire and its frontiers during the expansionist phase of the late Republic and early imperial periods. In exchange for remaining independent and benefiting from Roman protection, a client ruler was expected to agree that, on her death, Rome would succeed to and incorporate the kingdom into the empire. In AD 60-61, the Roman imperial enterprise in Britain nearly came to a halt following the forced and violent annexation of the East Anglican client kingdom of the Iceni, which resulted in the revolt of Queen Boudicca. Eventually, she was defeated by a Roman army, or Boudicca. Roman army under the general Suetonius Paulinus. However, there was no further Roman advance in Britain until the reign of Emperor Vespasian. Like Claudius before him, Vespasian needed a victory or 2 to gain legitimacy as emperor in the eyes of other leading families and potential rivals in Rome. His eye fell upon northern Britain, where he presumably thought that conquest would be relatively easy, as the Britons were not regarded as very sophisticated militarily in terms of armaments or organisation. Furthermore, there was merit to being acquired by finishing a project left incomplete by previous emperors, a project that was, moreover, associated with Julius Caesar himself. As we understand it from Tacitus, the occasion of the Roman invasion of the north was a flare-up of a dispute in the royal house of the Brigantes between Queen Cartimandua, a client ruler who had good relations with Rome, and her former consort Venetinius, who opposed the Roman advance. However, the danger of a hostile leader in the north would only have been a pretext for further imperial expansion in Britain. Unfortunately, we know little about Caramenda, apart from the free references in Tacitus' works, but she was unusual in being, like Boadicea, a woman with political authority, an authority that derived presumably from her lineage in one of the native aristocratic houses. Nevertheless, Cartimundia seems to have been a very different proposition from women of the Roman world, who usually played little formal part in public affairs. Little formal part in public affairs, a lot in private affairs, and private of the public affairs. Her residence, or one of them, is thought to have been at Stanwick, near Richmond, that's north of Yorkshire, not the Richmond in London, where there is a massive enclosure of 300 hectares in extent, surrounded by a bank and a ditch. Vespasian sent the newly appointed governor of Britain, Petulius Xerius, with a legion he commanded at the time of Boadicea, the ninth Hispania, so named because of a long stay in Spain, early in Emperor Augustus' reign, north from the fortress at Lincoln, Lindum. The main body of the legion, accompanied by other units, probably took a route which, in due course, became the main Roman road to York and the northeast. From Doncaster, where a fort, Danham, would be established, the army then stuck closely to a ridge of slightly elevated ground, formed by a narrowing Magnesian limestone belt that runs through this part of England. The men crossed the Calder at Castleford, which would become another fort site, Lagentium, and headed towards Tadcaster, Calcearia, and on the River Wharfe. Just before Tadcaster, the legion would have turned to the northeast, leaving the Magnesian limestone for the final 20 kilometres to York, but where possible following a slightly raised ground on the York moraine. In addition, some of the troops probably headed due north from Lincoln up the Roman road, now Ermain Street, and across the Humber to Brough on Humber, where there is an early fort, Peturia, along the tides and other hazards of this, although the tides and other hazards in the estuary would have made this a difficult exercise. The Roman army. The arrival of the army and its many camp followers would lead to major change in the makeup of the population in the York area. In view of this, and in order to understand the character layout of a Roman fortress, it is necessary to have in mind an outline of the army's structure, personnel, and equipment in the late 1st and early 2nd centuries. The invasion in AD 43 had brought 4 legions to Britain, and there may have been detachments of others and an equivalent number of auxiliaries. After about the year 87, there were only 3 legions remaining, which would form the permanent garrison of the province for the rest of the Roman period. They were based in the fortresses at Carlon, Isca, near Newport in Monmouthshire, and Chester, Devon, as well as York. Throughout the Roman period, except perhaps when it was out on campaign, local residents like Julia Velva would have been only too aware of the army's presence. They would have seen great columns of men marching in and out of fortress gateways. They would have seen them being trained in the use of weapons and equipment, and they would have seen and heard the men entertaining themselves in the taverns and streets when off duty. A legion was made up of about 5,200 infantrymen, plus a small number of cavalry. All the men were Roman citizens, meaning they were privileged and wealthy members of the imperial society who had a direct stake in the defence and, if possible, expansion of the empire. Late 1st century legionnaires, serving in the west, were usually recruited in colonies in Italy and Gaul, but local recruitment in provinces, including Britain, gradually became more common. Auxiliary regiments, who formed the fort garrisons, were made up into units about 500 or 1,000 strong, whether infantry, cavalry, or a mixture of the two. They were raised from subject peoples throughout the empire, hence they were, except for their officers, usually non-citizens. Unit names, such as the 4th Cohort of Gauls, based at Castleford, Lagentium, often reflected their origins. The principal function of both the legionary fortresses and forts was to provide accommodation for the men and their equipment. Although they had defences to prevent sudden attacks by hostile forces or intrusion by wild animals, they were not like medieval castles, primarily designed for defence, but were bases from which the Roman army would go out to fight in the field, where its superior discipline and weaponry could be brought to bear on the enemy. This is a very good book. It has all the detail you could ever possibly want, and a very cool story, and a very cool history in it. And it's all about a very interesting person. It does feel, though, a bit at times, I would have to admit, like you are a gossip in ancient Rome, and this is the person you're talking about. But, everyone loves a little bit of a gossip sometimes. Thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed, and take care.